There is a man in a pit, not a metaphor. A real pit, a cistern with no water, only thick mud at the bottom, and a prophet slowly disappearing into that mud, while the most powerful religious and political leaders in Jerusalem either put him there or turned away and said nothing. And the one person who decided to act was an Ethiopian, a man the text identifies with precision. He did not send a message through someone safer. He walked directly into the king's palace, stood where powerful men could hear him, and named what he saw as evil. Because of what he did, the prophet lived. And because of what he did, God responded to him personally. Not a general blessing for a crowd. A direct, spoken, individual promise of protection, delivered by name. That story has been sitting in your Bible for over 2,600 years. And most congregations have never heard a sermon about it. Tonight we trace that thread. Through original Hebrew, through named scholars and verifiable sources, through a tradition that has been reading these texts carefully for over 1,600 years while much of this history went untaught. This is not a claim that every messenger in Scripture carried a specific ethnic identity. What this is a careful look at how the Bible uses the word messenger, how it describes Cushite figures at decisive moments, and why many readers were never taught to notice any of it. That is the honest frame, and what is inside that frame is already extraordinary enough. Stay with me. Let us start with one word. One specific Hebrew word that changes the title of this video, changes how you read certain passages you have heard 100 times, and opens a door that most Sunday school curricula never pointed toward. The word is Malak. In Hebrew, Malak means one who is sent, a messenger, someone dispatched with a purpose, moving from one place to another on behalf of someone with authority. That is the word at its core. Before any translation decision layers something else on top, now here is where it matters. When the Hebrew Bible uses the word Malak, it sometimes refers to what we would call a supernatural being, a messenger from God in the spiritual sense. But the same word is also used to describe human beings, people who are sent with a message, people who act on behalf of God in the physical world, people who show up at the exact moment the story needs someone to act and do the thing that nobody else was willing to do. One word, used for both across the Hebrew Bible. English translations made a choice across centuries of Bible publishing. When translators believed the Malak was supernatural, they wrote angel. When they believed that the Malak was human, they wrote messenger. That decision seems reasonable on the surface. But look at what it actually does to a reader. It creates the impression of two completely separate categories. Supernatural angels on one side, human messengers on the other. Clean distinction. No overlap. Nothing connecting them. But that is not what the Hebrew text suggests. The most important question about a Malak is not whether they have wings. It is whether they were sent, whether they carried something necessary, and whether they acted when the moment required it. That is the definition this video uses consistently from this point forward, not a departure from the text. A return to what the text says before centuries of translation choices shaped how we read it. Now here is why that definition changes everything. When you read the Bible with that definition in mind, certain figures who have been sitting quietly in the background of your entire reading life suddenly step forward. Figures who were sent. Figures who carried something necessary. Figures who acted when the story needed someone to act. When everyone around them with more institutional power chose something easier. And when you ask where those figures came from, the text has answers. Specific answers. Geographic answers. Answers with names attached to them. Answers that have been in your Bible the entire time. The scholar Will Gaffney, whose book Womanist Midrash was published by Westminster John Knox Press in 2017, has written about what she calls textual invisibility, the phenomenon where a figure is clearly present in the text, clearly named, clearly acting at a significant moment, and yet the tradition built around that text consistently moves past them without stopping. Textual invisibility is not caused by one dramatic decision. It is caused by accumulation, by what gets sermon time and what gets moved past, by which figures receive extended commentary and which ones appear in a footnote. Here is what I need you to understand before we meet the figures waiting ahead. They are not invisible in the text. They are visible, named, described, placed at moments of consequence by writers who understood those moments needed to last. What made them hard to see was not the text. It was what accumulated on top of the text across centuries of reading. And those two things, the text and the tradition built on top of it, are not the same thing. One of them can be corrected. One of them has been doing its job for thousands of years, keeping certain figures in the story whether or not the tradition around it chose to reflect them fully. Keep the word Malak close. One who is sent, one who carries something necessary, one who acts when the moment requires it. Every person we meet from this point forward fits that definition, in ways that will stay with you long after this video ends. Most people who grew up in church know exactly one version of Gabriel. December, the angel who appeared to Mary, the messenger who announced something so large that the world has been measuring time from that moment ever since. Gabriel in candlelight. Gabriel in the Christmas story. Gabriel as the bearer of the best news the world has ever received. That version is real, and it is beautiful, but it is half the picture. Because there is another place Gabriel appears in your Bible, a place that almost never gets mentioned from a pulpit. And when you read it, when you understand the world Gabriel was operating in at that moment, something shifts. The message Gabriel carried takes on a weight that the Christmas story alone cannot give you. The Book of Daniel. Now before we go further, I want to be honest about something, because intellectual honesty is the standard this video holds from beginning to end. The Book of Daniel is one of the most discussed books in the entire Hebrew Bible when it comes to questions of composition and historical context. Scholars across traditions have engaged those questions seriously. What is not in dispute is this: Daniel is set in exile. It speaks powerfully to communities living under the weight of empire, and it was read and preserved by generations of people who found in it something they could not find anywhere else. Here is the world Gabriel operates in inside Daniel. Daniel is not in Jerusalem. He is not in the temple. He is surrounded by a foreign empire that has taken everything his community knew and replaced it with a version of reality built entirely for someone else's benefit. The language around him is not his language. The gods worshipped around him are not his God. And the version of reality promoted around him is designed to make him forget what he knows to be true. In that world, Gabriel appears, not to a king on a throne, not to a priest in a standing temple, to a man in exile, trying to hold on to something real in circumstances that gave him every reason to let go. John J. Collins, whose commentary on Daniel in the Hermenia series was published by Fortress Press in 1993, argues that the visions in Daniel were written to sustain the faith of communities living under imperial domination. The visions are not escape from the situation. They are a framework for understanding the situation, a way of seeing what is actually happening underneath the surface of empire. And Gabriel is the one who provides that framework. Gabriel does not come to Daniel and tell him everything is fine. Gabriel comes and explains the vision, cuts through the noise, gives understanding to someone trying to see clearly in a world designed to obscure his vision. Now feel what that actually means. When you are living in a world that has constructed a version of reality placing you at the bottom of it, When the dominant narrative around you consistently says your story is secondary, when the institutions with authority over your life were not built with your flourishing in mind, the most dangerous and the most necessary thing you can have is the ability to see clearly. Not comfort. Clarity. The kind of clarity that tells you what is actually happening when empire wants you confused. The kind that lets you hold on to what you know is true when everything around you is designed to make you doubt it. The kind that allows you to keep moving when the surrounding world is built to make you stop. That is what Gabriel brings to Daniel. Not a comfortable feeling. A framework for seeing. And here is the moment of recognition I want you to sit with. The people Daniel was written for were not reading it from positions of safety. They were reading it from inside the situation. Under the weight of empire, trying to hold on to something real, a messenger came to one of them. Not to the powerful, not to the comfortable, but to a man in exile, and gave him the one thing that empire cannot manufacture and cannot take away: the ability to see clearly. If you have ever felt like you were trying to make sense of a world that was not built with your understanding in mind, if you have ever sat in a space where the dominant version of reality did not match what you knew in your body to be true, then Gabriel and Daniel is not just a Bible story about someone else a long time ago. It is the text saying that a Malak was sent, not to the throne, but to the exile, not to the powerful, but to the person trying to hold on. Not with comfort, but with clarity. And clarity, when everything around you is designed to produce confusion, is the most powerful gift a messenger can bring. That is Gabriel. Both versions, the one in December and the one in the dark. Now you know them both. Now, I want to take you somewhere. Most Bible readers have never been taken deliberately. Not to a famous story. Not to a verse you have seen quoted from a platform. To a chapter of the Hebrew prophetic literature that most Sunday school curricula either skip or move through so quickly that its weight never lands. A chapter that, when you slow down and read what the text is actually doing, turns out to contain one of the most striking descriptions of a people and their messengers in the entire Old Testament. The chapter is Isaiah 18. Before we read it, one piece of context. Because without context, prophetic literature flattens into decoration. With context, it lands in the body. The book of Isaiah contains sections scholars call oracles concerning the nations, passages where the prophet addresses specific peoples by name, not vague spiritual messages, real places with real addresses. And in chapter 18, a people described with geographic precision that leaves no ambiguity. The chapter opens. A land of whirring wings. Beyond the rivers of Cush. Stop at that phrase. Beyond the rivers of Cush. In the ancient Near Eastern world, Cush referred to the region south of Egypt, the area we now call Nubia and Sudan, with connections extending into the broader Horn of Africa. This is not poetry in a vague sense. This is a geographic address, a specific location, a real people the prophet is turning toward. Randall Bailey, whose academic work on African presence in the Old Testament has been published by the Society of Biblical Literature, has argued that the consistent pattern of Western interpretation has been to treat these geographic references as background details rather than as foregrounded narrative elements. The text names them first. The tradition decided not to linger. We are going to linger. Because look at how Isaiah 18 actually describes this people. Verse 2. A nation tall and smooth-skinned. A people feared far and wide. Powerful and aggressive. A nation whose land the rivers divide. This is not the language of weakness. This is not a people at the margins of the ancient world. This is the prophet of Israel looking at a specific people and acknowledging what they actually are. Power, stature, consequence. The prophet is not condescending to them. He is seeing them. Now, verse 2 also describes messengers, Malak, in motion. Scholars have genuinely debated the direction of those messengers in the Hebrew construction. Are they being sent to this people or from this people? Different translators have made different choices because the text allows for both readings. What is not in debate is that messengers are moving between the wider world and this specific people, and that movement matters enough to the prophet that he records it at the very beginning. And then verse 7. At that time gifts will be brought to the Lord of hosts from a people tall and smooth, from a people feared near and far, a powerful and aggressive nation, whose land the rivers divide, to Mount Zion, the place of the name of the Lord of hosts. Feel the structure of that sentence. The prophet points toward a future moment, and what he sees is this same people, described again with all the language of power from verse 2, moving toward Mount Zion, bringing gifts. The movement in that verse, as scholars of the text have noted, is toward voluntary offering rather than compelled tribute. This is not a defeated nation paying what was taken from them. This is a powerful people choosing to move toward God with intention. Now let me place two more texts alongside Isaiah 18, because together they form something a single text cannot. Zephaniah 3:10, from beyond the rivers of Cush, my worshippers, the daughter of my dispersed ones, shall bring my offering. Two phrases deserve your full attention. My worshippers, God speaking. The possessive is direct and unqualified, not people who will eventually qualify. My worshippers. The category is established before any condition is named. The daughter of my dispersed ones. Covenant language. A people scattered but not abandoned, separated from a center but still in relationship with the one who established it. The scattering is real. The belonging is not revoked. Will Gaffney, in her academic work on this passage, has described Zephaniah 3:10 as one of the most direct expressions of covenantal inclusion for a non-Israelite people in the entire prophetic literature. And then, Psalm 68, verse 31, princes shall come out of Egypt, Cush shall hasten to stretch out her hands to God. The Hebrew verb translated as hasten carries urgency and forward motion, not reluctant compliance. Not a people dragged into a relationship. Active movement. Hands already reaching. Stretched out with the urgency of people who know where they are going and are moving toward it before anyone tells them it is their turn. Now, I want you to stop moving forward for a moment. 3 texts. 3 different centuries. 3 different prophetic voices. And before we analyze what they mean together, I want you to simply feel what it is like to be a reader from the African diaspora, encountering these passages for the first time with full attention. Not a reader who was told their people appear in Scripture as servants or as cautionary examples. A reader who has just heard a prophet describe their geographic heritage as powerful and feared. Who has just heard God call a people beyond those rivers my worshippers before calling them anything else? Who has just read that those same people hasten toward God with urgency, not waiting, not hesitating, already in motion. That is not a footnote. That is a portrait. And for a reader who grew up wondering whether the Bible saw them at all, that portrait does not just inform, it lands somewhere deeper. It changes something in how you hold the text. In whether you feel like someone reading from the outside or someone finding their name inside a story that was always partly theirs. That is what careful reading produces. Not just knowledge, recognition. Now step back and look at all 3 texts together with that recognition in mind. Isaiah 18, Zephaniah 3:10, Psalm 68:31. The portrait across all 3 is consistent. A people described with power and stature. A people God calls my worshippers before anything else. A people whose movement toward God is characterized not by reluctance or compulsion but by urgency and intention and forward motion before anyone gives permission. I want to be precise about what I am claiming. These three texts do not establish a formal theological doctrine about a unique calling, assigned exclusively to one group for all of history. No mainstream academic commentary on these texts draws that conclusion. And I am not going to claim what the evidence does not support. What the texts do, taken together and read carefully, is form a consistent portrait, a portrait that has been in your Bible for more than 2.5 millennia. And the person who brings it into sharpest focus is not a prophet or a king. He is a man with a specific job in a specific palace who heard something happening that he could not ignore and decided to act when everyone around him chose silence. His name is Ebed-Melech, and his story is coming next. We started this video with a man in a pit. Now let us actually go there. Jeremiah chapter 38. Jerusalem is under siege. The Babylonian army is outside the walls. The city is running out of food. And Jeremiah, the prophet who has been telling the leadership for years that this moment was coming, is paying the price for having been right. A group of officials goes to King Zedekiah with a request, not to silence Jeremiah, to kill him. Their argument is cold and practical. He is discouraging the soldiers. He is weakening the will of the people. Let us put him in the cistern. And the king, the most powerful man in Jerusalem, gives an answer that reveals everything about who he is at this moment. He is in your hands, for the king can do nothing against you. The most powerful man in the city, and his response to a request to murder a prophet is, "I can do nothing." So they lower Jeremiah into the cistern. No water, only mud. And verse 6 tells you exactly what happened next. Jeremiah sank into the mud. Sit with that image. A prophet slowly disappearing into mud, while everyone with the power to stop it either ordered it or washed their hands of it. Now look at verse 7. When Ebed-Melech the Ethiopian, one of the eunuchs who was in the king's house, heard that they had put Jeremiah into the cistern, stop before he does anything. Just feel that opening. When he heard, not when he was officially notified, not when it came through proper channels. When he heard what happened to a prophet he had no institutional obligation to protect, in a city that was not his homeland, surrounded by powerful people who had just demonstrated exactly what they were capable of doing to someone who said the wrong thing. He heard. And then look at what he did. He went to the king, in public, at the Benjamin Gate, one of the main gathering places of the city, where powerful men could hear every word. And here is what he said. "My lord, the king, these men have done evil in all that they did to Jeremiah the prophet, whom they have cast into the cistern, and he will die there of hunger. For there is no bread left in the city." Name it. Out loud. In public. In front of people who were there when Jeremiah went into the pit. These men have done evil. Not a polite concern raised through back channels. Not a carefully worded request that left room for everyone to save face. A direct, public, politically dangerous naming of what had been done. Ebed-Melech was a eunuch in a foreign court. His social position made him entirely dependent on the favor of the people around him. The men who threw Jeremiah into the cistern were not minor officials. The risk of speaking was real, and he knew it. He spoke anyway. The king listens. He gives Ebed-Melech 30 men and the authority to act. And then Ebed-Melech goes to get Jeremiah out of the mud. Now, here is the detail I need you to stop at. The detail the text preserved for more than 2.5 millennia. The detail that tells you more about who Ebed-Melech was than anything else in the story. Before he lowers the ropes into the cistern, Ebed-Melech sends someone to get old rags and worn-out clothes, and he puts them under Jeremiah's arms, between the ropes and the skin. so that the ropes will not cut into him on the way up. He thought about whether the ropes would hurt. In the middle of a politically dangerous situation, with his own safety uncertain, with a man's life on the line and time running out, he stopped and thought about the ropes. Not just rescue. Kare. He thought about the pain of rope on skin that had already been through enough. He added that thought to his action without being asked. Without anyone requiring it. Without any audience to applaud the gesture. There is a kind of courage that acts when action is dangerous. That is rare enough. But there is a rarer kind of courage that acts and also stops to think about how to make the acting gentle. Ebed-Melech had both at exactly the same moment. Ancient texts do not preserve small details carelessly. The rags are in this story because they reveal something about who Ebed-Melech was at the level beneath performance. Courage can be strategic. Rescue can be performed for an audience. But thinking about whether the ropes will hurt when no one is watching and nothing requires it, that is character. That is who someone actually is. The text kept that detail for more than 2.5 millennia because it is worth keeping. Now look at what happens after Jeremiah is out of the cistern. Jeremiah chapter 39, verses 15 through 18. While Jeremiah is still confined in the court of the guard, before the city has fallen, God speaks a word through Jeremiah specifically for Ebed-Melech, not for the king who said, "I can do nothing," not for the priests who stayed silent, not for the officials who ordered the pit. For the Ethiopian man in the foreign palace who heard what happened and moved, here is what God says: "I will deliver you on that day. You shall not be given into the hand of the men of whom you are afraid, for I will surely save you. And you shall not fall by the sword, but you shall have your life as a prize of war. Because you have put your trust in me. Because you have put your trust in me." Not because of his title, not because of his nationality, because of what he did at the moment when faith required action and everyone with more power chose something easier. The book of Jeremiah is 52 chapters long. It moves through kings and priests and battles and the slow, terrible collapse of a city. And in those 52 chapters, very few individuals receive a personal word of divine protection like this one. The ones who do are people the text identifies as having acted in faithfulness at a moment when faithfulness costs something real. One of them is an Ethiopian man who worked in a foreign king's palace and thought about whether the ropes would hurt. John Bright, in his commentary on Jeremiah in the Anchor Bible series, notes the literary significance of the Ebed-Melech episode as a moment of moral clarity within the broader narrative of Jerusalem's failure. Kathleen O'Connor, in Jeremiah Pain and Promise, published by Fortress Press in 2011, describes Ebed-Melech as a counter-narrative within the book, an outsider who acts with greater integrity than the insiders at the most critical moment in the entire story. The book of Jeremiah is largely a story of failure. The leaders fail. The priests fail. The false prophets fail. The king who says I can do nothing fails completely. And in the middle of all that failure, the text places an Ethiopian man who does not fail, who sees clearly, speaks boldly, acts with care, and receives a personal divine response that the text preserved with the same tenderness Ebed-Melech showed when he went to find those rags. Let me say something directly to you. If you have ever been the only person in a room willing to name what you saw, where everyone around you knew exactly what was happening and chose silence, and where you had to decide whether to speak anyway, knowing what it might cost, Ebed-Melech is your text. Not a metaphor, not an inspiration poster, a specific man, in a specific crisis, in a foreign city, who heard something and moved when everyone with more power said, I can do nothing. The text kept him, God noticed him, and now you know his name. Most Christians in America grew up with a Bible that contains 66 books. They were told, directly or by the shape of their religious education, that those 66 books represent the complete and recognized Word of God. Most people never questioned that number. Most people never asked who decided it, when they decided it, or whether other communities of Christians made different decisions and kept reading different texts. There are, and one of them has been there for over 1,600 years. The Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church holds a broader canon than the 66-book Western Protestant Bible. The core tradition encompasses approximately 81 books. Though the precise count reflects variations across different communities within the tradition, the same God, the same Jesus, the same resurrection, but additional texts that the Ethiopian Church has been reading, copying, preserving, and teaching from within an ancient Christian tradition whose roots reach back to the earliest centuries of the faith. Before we go further, I need to establish something clearly. The Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church is not a fringe movement. It is not a small community making claims from obscurity. It is one of the oldest continuously existing Christian institutions on earth. Its roots trace to the 4th century of the Common Era, when Christianity became the official religion of the Aksumite Empire, one of the most powerful kingdoms of the ancient world at that time. The Church has maintained unbroken institutional existence through the rise and fall of empires, through the medieval period, through the colonial era, through the 20th century, to the present day, tens of millions of members, its own theological tradition, its own liturgical language in ancient Ge'ez, its own canon that it has never abandoned. That is historical documentation. Verifiable, not in dispute. Now let us talk about one specific text at the center of this tradition, because this is where the story moves from interpretation to archaeology. And archaeology does not argue. It does not have a theological position to defend. It finds things and reports what it finds. The book known as 1st Enoch. 1st Enoch is one of the texts in the Ethiopian canon. It is not in the 66-book Western Protestant Bible. But here is what most people who grew up in Western Christianity were never told. It is quoted in the New Testament. The book of Jude, chapter 1, verses 14 and 15, contains a direct quotation from 1st Enoch. The writer of Jude knew 1st Enoch well enough to quote it as authoritative text. The quotation stayed in the New Testament. The book it came from did not make it into the Western canon. The Ethiopian Church kept the book. In 1947, manuscripts were discovered in caves near the Dead Sea in what is now Israel. The Dead Sea Scrolls. Among them were Aramaic fragments of 1st Enoch, multiple fragments from multiple caves. 1st Enoch was not an obscure text at the margins of ancient Jewish reading. It was being actively copied and studied in Jewish communities in the centuries before the birth of Jesus. Michael Knibb, a scholar of Second Temple Judaism at King's College London, whose work on the Aramaic fragments of 1st Enoch is among the most detailed in the field, has established that the Ethiopic text of 1st Enoch represents a careful and ancient transmission. His conclusion is textual, not theological. The text the Ethiopian Church preserved is genuinely ancient. It represents a tradition that predates the New Testament period. Think about what that means in practical terms. A church in northeastern Africa, copying a manuscript in Ge'ez across many centuries, generation after generation of scribes preserving a text that much of the Western world had set aside. And then the world digs up caves at Qumran and pulls out the Aramaic originals. And the match is there. The text was real. The tradition was sound. The church that preserved and read these books across many centuries was keeping something genuinely worth keeping. The same pattern holds for the Book of Jubilees. Another text in the Ethiopian canon also found at Qumran. James Vanderkam, a scholar of Second Temple literature at the University of Notre Dame, whose work on Jubilees has been published in multiple peer-reviewed journals and academic volumes, has established that Jubilees was a significant and widely read text in the period of Second Temple Judaism. The Ethiopian Church preserved it when other traditions moved on. The Dead Sea Scrolls confirm that what they were preserving was genuinely ancient. Now, what does 1st Enoch actually contain that connects to everything we have been building? 1st Enoch is concerned, in significant part, with the nature and activity of heavenly messengers. Malak, one section of the book, known to scholars as the Book of the Watchers, which refers to the opening portion of 1st Enoch dealing with angelic figures and their interactions with the human world, names 7 archangels by name, each identified with a specific designation. The level of specificity is striking compared to how angels are typically described in the passages most Western Christians encounter regularly. These are not background figures. They are named. They are specific. They are active participants in the story of the world. The tradition that preserved that portrait is not a European tradition. It is an African tradition. The church in northeastern Africa preserved and read a detailed account of heavenly messengers across many centuries. In Gaze, in a community that did not hold institutional power in the Western theological world. And when the caves at Qumran gave us the Aramaic originals, the tradition that had been keeping the text all along was confirmed as having kept it faithfully. Edward Ullendorf, whose book Ethiopia and the Bible was published by the British Academy in 1968, described the relationship between the Ethiopian Church and the biblical texts it preserved as one of the most significant and most underappreciated chapters in the history of Christian scripture. Significant and underappreciated. Not absent, not peripheral, significant, and consistently overlooked by a tradition that did not always look closely enough to see what was actually there. Now I want you to feel something before we move to the next chapter. When you ask who preserved the ancient and detailed understanding of these heavenly messengers, who kept reading the texts that describe them with specificity and names across centuries, who maintained that tradition without interruption while much of the Western world set those texts aside? The answer is not a European institution. The answer is a church in northeastern Africa, a church that never accepted the idea that its heritage was outside the story, a church that preserved and read these books across many centuries, including texts whose antiquity was later supported by the Dead Sea Scrolls, and was confirmed by the desert when the time came for confirmation. The books kept the promise, and the church kept the books. The Ethiopian Church preserved and read these books across many centuries, and yet most people sitting in churches across America today have never heard a sermon about Ebed-Melech, have never been shown the repetition in Numbers 12 verse 1, have never been told that Acts 8 places a major southward movement carrying the gospel before the Pauline westward mission becomes the dominant narrative, have never been given the portrait that 3 different prophetic voices preserved across 3 different centuries. The books were there. The tradition that preserved them was there. And still, for most congregations, these figures remained invisible. How does that happen? Not through one dramatic decision, not through a single council that voted to remove Cushite figures from the curriculum, through accumulation, through the slow, quiet, compounding weight of choices made across generations that built on each other until the absence felt like it was always that way. Let us trace that process, because understanding it is not about assigning blame across centuries of history. It is about understanding how traditions work, how certain readings get built in and alternative readings get built out, and why the correction that is possible requires knowing exactly what produced the problem in the first place. Start with the most foundational layer. In the 17th and 18th centuries, as the transatlantic slave trade was expanding into one of the largest forced migrations in human history, a theological problem presented itself to the people building economic systems on that forced labor. The Bible they were reading contained statements about human dignity, about the image of God in every person, about a God who acts on behalf of the oppressed. You cannot read Exodus without noticing that God takes the side of enslaved people. You cannot read the prophets without encountering a God who holds nations accountable for what they do to the vulnerable. An economic system built on enslaving millions needed a theological justification, and certain interpreters reached for Genesis chapter 9. Noah curses Canaan, the son of Ham, after Ham sees his father's nakedness. That is what the text says. The curse is on Canaan, not on Ham, not on Ham's descendants broadly, not on African peoples. Canaan. The text is specific and limited, but certain interpreters stretched that specific and limited text into something it never said. They argued that Ham's descendants broadly, identified as African peoples, were destined for perpetual servitude. They preached it from pulpits. They wrote it into theological texts. They built it into the curriculum of institutions that trained the pastors who trained the congregations who accepted it as biblical truth across generations. David Goldenberg, in his book The Curse of Ham, Race and Slavery in Early Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, published by Princeton University Press in 2003, provides one of the most comprehensive scholarly analyses of this interpretation ever produced. His conclusion is unambiguous. The racial reading of the Hamitic curse is not in the original text. It was constructed and applied centuries after the text was written to serve purposes that had nothing to do with what the biblical writers intended. That is the conclusion of a detailed, peer-reviewed scholarly work from one of the most respected academic presses in the world. And here is why that matters for everything we have been doing tonight. That framework did not just affect how people read Genesis 9. It created a gravitational pull on the entire interpretive tradition. When generations of readers are shaped to associate African identity in Scripture with curse and servitude, that association works against slowing down for the African woman God defended in Numbers 12. It works against lingering on the Ethiopian man who received a personal divine promise in Jeremiah 39. It works against feeling the full weight of a people beyond the rivers of Cush being called my worshippers in Zephaniah 3:10. The framework works against those readings even when the text is right in front of you. You have been shaped, through no fault of your own, to move past certain things before you have fully read them. Colin Kidd, in his book, The Forging of Race's Race, Scripture, and the Protestant Atlantic World, published by Cambridge University Press in 2006, documents this accumulation with historical precision. His argument is not that every individual interpreter was acting in deliberate bad faith. His argument is that the cumulative weight of choices made across generations, each one seeming unremarkable in isolation, produced a tradition with a very specific and consistent shape, a shape that made African presence in Scripture consistently less visible than the text itself would support. Now let us talk about translation, because this is where the process becomes concrete and traceable. The word Cushite appears throughout the Hebrew Bible as a specific geographic and ethnic identifier. When the Hebrew text writes Cushite, it is giving you a specific piece of information about who this person is and where their people are from. Look at what happened across centuries of English translation. The King James Bible, published in 1611, translated Cushite as Ethiopian in many places. Other translations used Cushite more consistently. Still, others handled it differently across different passages. sometimes with footnotes and sometimes with no explanation at all. The result is that a modern reader can encounter the same figure described differently depending on which Bible edition they are holding. And when the teaching tradition does not stop to explain the geographic context, the reader loses the ability to recognize a consistent identity moving through the text. The Cushite woman in Numbers 12. Ebed-Melech in Jeremiah 38. The people described in Isaiah 18. The worshippers beyond the rivers of Cush in Zephaniah 3:10. In the experience of most readers, these feel like separate, unconnected references rather than what they actually are. A consistent portrait of a specific people, appearing across multiple books written across multiple centuries. The inconsistency of translation is not always the result of bad intent. Translators made decisions based on the scholarly consensus of their time, and that consensus was itself shaped by the broader interpretive framework we have been describing. But the effect, regardless of intent, was that a coherent thread became harder to follow as a coherent thread. Now let us talk about seminary curriculum. And here, I want to be precise about what I am saying and what I am not. The standard curriculum of most Western Christian seminaries has historically been built around European theological frameworks, Greek philosophical categories, and a canon of commentators that is largely European. That is documented in the academic literature on theological education. It is not a secret. It is the historical shape of how Western Christianity developed its educational institutions. The consequence is straightforward. When pastors are trained in systems that do not emphasize African presence in Scripture, they graduate and preach without that emphasis. Not because they are dishonest, because they were not taught to look for it. And when generation after generation of pastors preach without it, congregations grow up without it. Not because the text is hiding anything, because the educational pipeline connecting the text to the congregation has a consistent gap at exactly that point. Corey Edwards, in her book The Elusive Dream, published by Oxford University Press in 2008, documents the measurable effects on Black Christians of receiving a religious tradition that consistently centers European figures and frameworks. Her research shows that when people cannot find themselves reflected in the stories told about the God they worship, that absence has real effects on spiritual confidence, on sense of belonging, and on religious identity. What is missing is not just historical information. What is missing is the experience of recognition, of reading a text and finding in it not just a God who loves people in general, but a God who saw specific people, who placed figures from their part of the world at decisive moments, who gave personal promises to an Ethiopian man in a foreign palace when that man acted with courage and care. That experience of recognition is not a supplement to be added once the real theology has been covered. It is part of what Scripture has always been for. And here is the thing that all those accumulated layers could not accomplish. They could not change the text. The layers could limit access. The translation inconsistencies could make the thread harder to follow. The curriculum gaps could ensure that whole generations of pastors never learned to slow down for certain passages. But none of that could reach into the manuscripts and remove what was there. Ebed-Melech is still in Jeremiah 38. The Cushite woman is still in Numbers 12. The people beyond the rivers of Cush are still being called my worshippers in Zephaniah 3:10. The Ethiopian official is still going home rejoicing in Acts 8. The text held on to them when the tradition did not fully reflect them, which means the correction required is not the invention of something new. It is the recovery of something that was always there. I want to try something with you right now. I want you to think about the last time you read something and felt a specific kind of recognition. Not just finding information interesting. The deeper thing. The moment when words describe something you had already known in your body for a long time but had never had language for. That kind of recognition does not happen because someone told you something new. It happens because someone told you something true, something already real in your experience. And now suddenly, there is a frame for it. A way of seeing what you already knew. That is what the text does for the people it names. And I want to walk you through what that actually looks like in practice. Not as a concept, in specific passages, with the kind of attention that produces recognition rather than just information. Start with Numbers 12. Miriam and Aaron spoke against Moses because of the Cushite woman whom he had married. For he had married a Cushite woman. That is verse 1. And notice what the writer does with that single sentence. They say the same thing twice. He married a Cushite woman. For he had married a Cushite woman. In Hebrew literary practice, immediate repetition like this is deliberate emphasis. The writer is telling you before you read another word. Do not move past this detail. This is what the conflict is actually about. Now feel what that means for the Cushite woman herself. She never speaks in this passage. We never learn her name from the canonical text. She does not argue her case or defend her presence or explain herself to anyone. And yet the entire conflict in Numbers 12 begins because of who she is. Her identity is not incidental to the story. Her identity is the story. Miriam is one of the most celebrated figures in the entire Exodus narrative. A prophetess. A leader. Someone, the book of Micah, names alongside Moses and Aaron as one of 3 leaders God sent before the people. And the conflict she raises is about one specific thing. The Cushite woman. Her presence. Her identity. Her being there. And then God responds. God calls all 3 to the tent of meeting. God speaks directly. God defends Moses. And when the divine presence withdraws, it is Miriam who is struck with Sarah, the skin condition the Hebrew uses elsewhere for leprosy. The narrative begins with a challenge to the Cushite woman's presence and ends with a divine response that turns entirely toward the people who raise the challenge. The Cushite woman does not need to defend herself, because before she can say a single word, the text resolves the situation in a way that leaves no ambiguity about whose presence God was protecting. Sit with that recognition for a moment. If you have ever been in a space where your identity was treated as the problem, where who you are became the thing that made other people uncomfortable, where your presence itself was the source of a conflict you did not start, Numbers 12 is a text you deserve to know. Not because it resolves every complexity in one chapter, but because it shows you exactly how the God of the biblical text responded when that kind of challenge was raised directly in front of him. The Cushite woman does not speak. She does not need to. The text speaks for her. Now go to Jeremiah. Not to review Ebed-Melech, but to feel something specific about how the text preserves his story. The book of Jeremiah is 52 chapters long. It covers decades of history, kings, and battles, and the collapse of an entire city. And in those 52 chapters, the text stops to record the detail about old rags placed under Jeremiah's arms so the ropes would not cut into his skin. Why does a writer with a large and consequential story to tell stop for a detail that small? Because that detail is not small. Courage can be strategic. Rescue can be performed for an audience. But thinking about whether the ropes will hurt when no one is watching and nothing requires it, that is character. That is who someone actually is beneath the performance. The text kept that detail for more than 2.5 millennia because some things are worth keeping. Because the people who would come after needed to know not just that an Ethiopian man saved a prophet, but how he saved him. With what quality of attention? With what kind of care? Now here is the pattern I want you to see. In Numbers 12, the Cushite woman does not defend herself before God responds. In Jeremiah 38, Ebed-Melech acts before anyone with institutional power is willing to act. In Isaiah 18, the people beyond the rivers of Cush bring gifts to Zion voluntarily, before anyone compels them. In Zephaniah 3:10, They are called my worshippers, before any condition is named. In Psalm 68:31, Cush hastens to stretch out her hands before anyone tells her it is time. Do you see it? In every single one of these moments, the figure the text identifies as Cushite or Ethiopian does not wait for permission, does not wait for validation from the institutional structures around them, does not wait for the surrounding world to acknowledge that their presence is legitimate or their action is authorized. They move. They reach. They act. They are already in the middle of the right thing before the moment catches up to them. That is not coincidence. In literature as carefully constructed as the Hebrew and Greek texts of Scripture, patterns across multiple books, written across multiple centuries, are not accidental. They reflect something the writers saw and felt compelled to record with consistency. And here is the recognition I want you to carry forward. That pattern, moving before permission, reaching before authorization, being already in motion toward God before the surrounding world has made that motion comfortable or rewarded, did not begin in any modern moment. It is not a product of contemporary cultural identity or political framework. It is a portrait that the ancient writers preserved across thousands of years, which means it was always there, waiting for a generation with the access and the clarity to read it fully. That generation is reading it right now. When you think about how the gospel spread in the book of Acts, what direction do you picture? Most people picture west, Jerusalem to Antioch, Antioch to Greece, Greece to Rome. That is the arc most of us were taught. That is the map drawn in Sunday school classrooms. West, always west. As if the story only mattered once it reached the direction of Europe. But Acts chapter 8 is placed before any of that western movement, and it goes south. That sequence invites reflection on what Luke chose to tell first. Luke, one of the most intentional writers in the New Testament, made choices about the order in which he told the story of the early church. He placed this episode here, before the Pauline missions, before the famous journeys through Greece and Macedonia, before Rome. Now let us read what happened, slowly, with attention to every detail, because Luke does not include details carelessly. Philip, one of the 7 deacons appointed in Acts chapter 6, is directed by a Malak to go toward the road from Jerusalem down to Gaza. The direction is south. The Malak is sending Philip toward something Philip does not yet fully understand. On that road, Philip encounters a man, and here is how Luke describes him. He is Ethiopian. He is a eunuch. He is an official of Candace, queen of the Ethiopians, in charge of all her treasury. He had come to Jerusalem to worship, and he is now returning home, seated in his chariot, reading the prophet Isaiah. Every detail is deliberate. Let us go through them. He is Ethiopian. Luke names his nationality first. Before his title, before his role, before anything else. Where he is from is the first thing Luke wants you to know. He controls the entire treasury of a queen, a position of extraordinary trust and authority, one of the most consequential roles in an entire government. He had come to Jerusalem to worship, not for trade, not for diplomacy. He made a long and difficult journey specifically to seek God. This man, with all his wealth and all his authority, was hungry for something that wealth and authority could not give him. And he is reading Isaiah 53 on the way home. Not a simple psalm of praise. Isaiah 53, the suffering servant passage, one of the most theologically complex and contested texts in the entire Hebrew Bible. A text about suffering and meaning and what it costs to carry something that belongs to someone else. You do not stumble into Isaiah 53. You go there because you are searching, and you have a sense that the answer might be there. Philip runs to the chariot. Do you understand what you are reading? And the Ethiopian official gives an answer that reveals everything about who he is. How can I? Unless someone guides me. And he invites Philip in. Stop here. Because this moment matters more than it is usually given credit for. Philip did not find a man who had never encountered God. He found a man who had already traveled to Jerusalem to worship, who was already reading one of the most profound prophetic texts in the Bible, who was already asking the right questions, who was already in the middle of a search that had been going on long before Philip appeared on that road. The gospel came to this man not as news about a God he had never considered. It came as the answer to questions he was already carrying, as the key to a door he had already been standing in front of, already knocking on, already trying to understand. Philip explained the text. The man received the explanation. He asked to be baptized. There is water right there by the road. Philip baptizes him. And then Luke writes something worth sitting with. The Spirit of the Lord carried Philip away, and the eunuch saw him no more, and went on his way rejoicing. He went on his way rejoicing. Back to Ethiopia, back to the court of Candace, back to his position as the man who controlled the queen's treasury, carrying what he had received on that road, carrying it home, carrying it south. Now I want to be honest about a genuine scholarly debate. There is a real discussion about whether this official represents the first Gentile conversion in Acts. The traditional position in much of Western Christianity holds that Cornelius in Acts chapter 10 represents that moment. That reading is defensible and has a long history. Acts chapter 10 is given more narrative space, and Acts chapter 11 frames it as a breakthrough moment for Gentile inclusion. What is accurate is this. Acts places a major southward movement carrying the gospel to a non-Jewish recipient before the Pauline westward mission becomes the dominant narrative. What is not in dispute is that Luke described this Ethiopian official with extraordinary precision. Every detail was a deliberate choice, and the direction he traveled when he left was south. The Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church reads this moment as one of its foundational memories. That church has maintained unbroken institutional existence for over 1,600 years. Its own liturgy in ancient Ge'ez, its own theological tradition, its own canon, including texts whose antiquity was later supported by the Dead Sea Scrolls. Tens of millions of members alive today. That is not a legend. That is a 1,600-year-old institution that exists right now, reading this same passage in Ge'ez. Because a community chose to carry this moment forward and never stopped. Now, feel what the text is actually showing across this entire episode. Malak sent Philip south. Philip found a man who was already searching. The man received what he had been looking for and carried it home with joy. And what he carried home became a tradition of reading, a tradition of preservation, a tradition of keeping these texts alive across many centuries without stopping. The text sent a Malak south, and the South has been reading ever since. That is the part of the map that Sunday school left blank. Now you can see it. I want to tell you about a specific kind of moment. Not a dramatic moment. A quiet one. The kind that happens when you are alone with a text you have read before, and you read it again. And something that was always there suddenly lands differently. Not because the words changed. Because you changed. Because you are now reading with eyes that have seen something they cannot unsee. That moment is happening right now. In this generation, in communities of African descent across the world. And it is worth describing carefully, not with the language of prophecy being checked off, with the language of what actually happens when people find themselves in a text that was always carrying them. Corey Edwards. In The Elusive Dream, published by Oxford University Press in 2008, documented what happens when people cannot find themselves in the stories told about the God they worship. The research shows measurable effects on spiritual confidence, on sense of belonging, On religious identity, absence does not feel neutral. It feels like exclusion. It shapes how you hold your faith and whether you feel entitled to hold it fully. But Edwards was writing before this particular moment, and what her research implies, extended forward, is what happens when the absence is replaced by recognition. When someone reads Numbers 12 slowly for the first time and stops at that repetition in verse 1, when the realization lands that the entire conflict in that chapter exists because of who a specific woman is, and that God resolved it without asking her to justify her presence. When a person who has spent years feeling like their identity was the problem in a room full of people with more institutional power reads that passage and understands, not as theology in the abstract, but as personal truth, that the God of the biblical text saw that exact situation and responded in a specific way. That is not information being received. That is recognition. And recognition changes something in the body that information alone cannot reach. Now think about what happens when that same reader finds Ebed-Melech, not just the broad strokes of the story, the detail, the old rags, the thought about whether the ropes would hurt, the realization that a man under pressure, in a foreign city, with his own safety uncertain, stopped to think about the skin of the person he was rescuing. For a reader who has spent years wondering whether the God of the biblical text sees the kind of care that does not get applauded, that detail does not just inform, it confirms something. Something they already knew in their bones about what faithfulness looks like when no one is watching. And finding it in the text, preserved for more than 2.5 millennia, landing in their ears right now. That is the moment recognition changes from a feeling into a foundation. Howard Thurman, in Jesus and the Disinherited, published by Beacon Press in 1949, described a quality of spiritual directness that comes from having your back against the wall. He observed it across generations of the Black church. A refusal to let go of God even when God felt absent. A persistence of worship that did not depend on comfortable circumstances, because comfortable circumstances were rarely available. What Thurman was describing, without using these specific texts, is the posture that Psalm 68:31 calls hastening to stretch out her hands. The hands were already reaching before the comfort arrived, before the validation came, before anyone gave permission. And here is what I want you to feel right now. That posture, that urgency, that forward motion toward God before anyone authorizes it, is not just a historical observation about people who lived and died centuries ago. It is the portrait the ancient writers preserved of a specific people, a portrait that has been in the text for more than 2.5 millennia, a portrait that survived every layer of interpretation that tried to make it invisible. And when the people that portrait describes read it clearly for the first time, something specific happens. Not just intellectual understanding, recognition, the kind that lands in the body, the kind that says, this was always about me. Not me as an afterthought. Me as someone the text was always carrying. That confidence changes how you pray. It changes how you read. It changes what you believe you are entitled to bring to the text and who you understand yourself to be when you bring it. It changes everything. And it starts with slowing down for a repetition in verse 1 of Numbers 12. With stopping at the detail about the rags in Jeremiah 38, with following the Ethiopian official all the way home in Acts 8 and asking what he was carrying when he got there. It starts with reading more carefully than you were taught to read, which is exactly what you have been doing tonight. We started with a man in a pit, a cistern with no water, only mud at the bottom, and a prophet slowly disappearing while everyone with institutional power either ordered it or said, I can do nothing. And the one person who decided to act was an Ethiopian. A man, the text identifies, with precision. We followed that thread all the way through the Hebrew word Malak and what it actually means when you read it in its own language, through Gabriel in Daniel, arriving not at a throne but at an exile, carrying not comfort but the ability to see clearly when empire was designed to take that clarity away, through Isaiah 18 and Zephaniah 3:10 and Psalm 68:31, and the portrait that three different prophetic voices preserved across three different centuries, through Ebed-Melech and the detail about the rags that the text kept for more than 2.5 millennia, through the Ethiopian Church and the manuscripts they preserved and read across many centuries, including texts whose antiquity was later supported by the Dead Sea Scrolls, through the layers of interpretation that made certain figures harder to see without being able to remove them from the text, through Numbers 12 and the Cushite woman whose presence the text protected before she could say a single word in her own defense, through the pattern across all of these passages of people who move before permission and reach before authorization and act before anyone tells them it is their turn, through the Ethiopian official on the road to Gaza, already reading, already searching, going home rejoicing with something he had been looking for his entire life. And now we are here. The question is not, what did you learn tonight? The question is, what are you going to do with it? Not as a feeling you carry for a few days and let fade. In the specific, in the practical, in the actual change to how you read starting this week. 3 passages. This week. Not as homework. As a reader who now knows what to look for and why it matters, go to Numbers 12. Read the whole chapter from the beginning. When you reach verse 1, stop at the repetition. He married a Cushite woman. For he had married a Cushite woman. Ask what the writer is telling you by saying it twice in the same sentence. Follow the conflict through to its end. Ask whose presence God was protecting when the divine response came. And then ask yourself whether there is a space in your own life. A church. A workplace. A family. Where someone's identity is being treated as the problem. And what the God of Numbers 12 would say about that. Go to Jeremiah 38. Read through to chapter 39. Verses 15 through 18. Do not move through it quickly. Follow Ebed-Melech at the pace he actually moved. Stop at the rags. Sit with the thought about the ropes. Ask what it means to act with that quality of care when no one requires it. Ask what God's personal promise to him says about what faithfulness looks like when it costs something real. And then ask yourself what situation in your own life is asking for that kind of courage right now. Go to Acts 8, verse 26, through the end of the chapter. Read every detail Luke includes. The nationality named first. The role. The journey to Jerusalem just to worship. The specific text being read on the way home. The question asked with honesty. The joy carried south. Ask why a precise and intentional writer chose to tell this story here. Before the famous Western missions. Ask what it means that this man was already searching before Philip arrived. And ask what you might already be carrying. What search you might already be in the middle of. That is more advanced than you have been given credit for. 3 passages. 3 questions each. That is not homework. That is an invitation to find yourself in a text that has been carrying your portrait for more than 2.5 millennia. Now 3 scholars whose work will take you deeper into everything this video opened. Howard Thurman, Jesus and the Disinherited. Beacon Press. 1949. Read it slowly. It will not give you information so much as it will give you a way of seeing. A framework for reading the Gospels from the position of the people who needed them most. Thurman was one of the most important theological voices of the 20th century, and most people who needed him most were never pointed toward him. That changes tonight. David Goldenberg. The Curse of Ham Race and Slavery in Early Judaism. Christianity and Islam. Princeton University Press. 2003. This is the book that takes the emotional weight of everything we covered in Chapter 6 and gives it a foundation in documented scholarship. It answers the question of where the Hamitic interpretation actually came from with the kind of precision that makes the answer impossible to ignore. Keep it somewhere you can hand it to someone who needs it. Edward Uhlendorf. Ethiopia and the Bible. The British Academy. 1968. This is the book that connects the manuscript tradition, the geographic history, and the theological significance of the Ethiopian Church in ways that bring First Enoch and the Dead Sea Scrolls and everything we covered in Chapter 5 into its full and proper context. Older but irreplaceable. 3 books. Not a complete library. A foundation. The kind that allows you to keep building in a direction the text has been pointing all along. Now here is how to bring this into conversation with other people. The figures we met tonight deserve more than one reader, but the way you share them matters. Arriving at every conversation with the energy of someone who has discovered something that everyone else must accept immediately closes doors before they open. Ask questions instead. Ask someone you trust if they have ever heard a sermon about Ebed-Melech. Ask if they know that the Ethiopian official in Acts 8 was already reading Isaiah 53 before Philip arrived. Ask if they have ever read Numbers 12 slowly and stopped at that repetition in verse 1 and asked what the writer meant by saying it twice. Questions like these do not put people on the defensive. They open something. They create the conditions for the same recognition you experienced tonight to happen for someone else. And that recognition, as we talked about in Chapter 9, does not just inform. It lands somewhere deeper. It changes how someone holds their faith and whether they feel fully entitled to hold it. That is worth having the conversation. For those of you in ministry, I want to say something directly. These figures belong in your teaching, not as a seasonal addition to the regular curriculum. As substantive parts of the biblical narrative that receive the same careful attention you give to everything else. Ebed-Melech belongs in your Jeremiah series, the same way the fall of Jerusalem belongs in your Jeremiah series. The Cushite woman belongs in your Numbers series with the same weight as the story of Miriam's leadership. The Ethiopian official belongs in your Acts series as the southward movement that preceded the westward one. You do not need a new curriculum. You need to linger longer on passages you have been moving past too quickly. You need to stop at the word Cushite and give your congregation the geographic context that lets them recognize a consistent identity moving through the text. You need to follow the Ethiopian official all the way home and ask your congregation what he was carrying when he got there. Read more carefully. Linger longer. Follow the details the text took the time to include. And for those of you who are parents, what the generation growing up right now needs from you is not just information. They will find information. What they need is a framework for understanding what the information means for who they are. They need to know that the portrait in the text is not something to argue for or prove. It is part of their inheritance. Already there. Already waiting. Tell them about Ebed-Melech and the rags. Tell them about the Cushite woman and the repetition in verse 1. Tell them about the Ethiopian official who was already reading Isaiah 53 before Philip arrived and who went home rejoicing with something he had been searching for his entire life. Let them grow up knowing that the Bible has been carrying their people's portrait for more than 2.5 millennia, waiting for a generation with the access and the clarity to read it fully. That generation is them, and the preparation they need begins with what you tell them this week. Now I want to close where we started. Not with a list, not with a final argument, with the detail that has been at the center of this entire journey from the very first sentence. The rags, Ebed-Melech, in a foreign palace, surrounded by powerful people who had just tried to kill the prophet he was about to rescue. Stopped before he lowered the ropes into the cistern. He sent someone to get old rags and worn-out clothes. He placed them under Jeremiah's arms. between the ropes and the skin, so that the ropes would not cut into him on the way up. He thought about whether the ropes would hurt. In the middle of a crisis, with his own safety uncertain, with time running out and everything on the line, he thought about the ropes. The text kept that detail for more than 2.5 millennia. Through every copying and every translation and every tradition that moved past Ebed-Melech without slowing down, that detail survived everything. Because it reveals something about who he was that nothing else in the story can show. Not his courage in front of the king. Not his boldness at the Benjamin gate. This. The rags. The thought about the skin. The decision to make the rescue gentle when nothing required gentleness. That is the portrait of a Malak. One who is sent. One who carries something necessary. One who acts when the moment requires it. And who thinks about the ropes. You did not find this video by accident. You slowed down long enough to follow a thread that most people walk past. You read more carefully than you were taught to read. And what you found at the end of that careful reading is not a surprise. It is confirmation of something that was always true. Your heritage was never outside the story. The messengers were always there. And now? So are you. Walk knowing that